Hey everybody, you are doing less once again with John and Jeff. Welcome back. To begin this episode, I'm going to actually turn it on you, Jeff. You're not expecting this, but I'm going to put you on the spot. And I'm going to ask you to, it's an exercise in steel manning, which we'll get to the main topic of our show after this little exercise. But I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to attempt to with full faith steel man the argument in, a couple words, maybe like a sentence, for Keynesian economics. Follow that by steel manning the argument for Austrian economics, and then you can speak to the difference between the two. I'll give you a little bit more time as I'm talking to think of your response, because yes, I am. I did not tell Jeff before the show started that I would be asking him to do this. So I will be impressed with whatever he comes up with, because it is kind of hard to boil down a whole school of economic thought into, one sentence or like one kind of idea that really captures. And the idea of steel manning, so just to describe it to the listener that's not aware, it's the opposite of straw manning. So a straw man is to take take a person that you're debating and just consider their least viable argument and then attack that. It's like attacking a straw man. It's like basically it takes no skill or strength or whatever. You're basically attacking not a real argument. But a steel man is to take an argument that you don't necessarily agree with and explain it in the best way possible. So, Jeff, what have you come up with?
How could you do this to me? I would say essentially the Keynesian argument in a nutshell is there's this concept of economic slack, which essentially is, imagine there's a recession and a bunch of people become unemployed. Well, those people are resources, right? Like they can produce things. And so if they're just unemployed, not doing anything productive, then there's essentially this slack in economic activity where we theoretically could be producing more than we're doing. And so because there might be some, let's say, fear in the market in investing, sort of this error in psychology of the marketplace, the government as a central planner can sort of take up that duty to employ those people or just spend on things to essentially create opportunities for those people that are unemployed to pick up the slack and basically fix the recession by making those unused resources used. How did I do?
That's pretty good. That's a little bit more than a sentence, but I think you nailed it. I mean, that's
if I'm steel manning, I can't just give it a sentence, right, John?
Well, okay, so that's what I came up with. I was thinking about this a lot longer than you, so I had some time to kind of concentrate my answer for the Keynesian school. So full disclosure, Jeff and I both subscribe to the Austrian school of thought of economics. We both disagree very much, which is at ends with the Keynesian school. I would say that the Keynesian school of economics thinks that achieving efficient output is achieved by centrally planned reallocation of resources.
Right. Much more concise than what I said.
Where the Austrians,
let me do the Austrian.
All right, go for the Austrian.
That one yet. I'd say the Austrian school essentially says that central planner, that government actor who's going to employ those resources, has access to no more information than anyone else in the marketplace. So if no one in the marketplace is hiring those people at the moment, there's no reason to believe the government can put them to any more productive use than anyone else. Because if there was, opportunity, an entrepreneur would take that opportunity to profit. So there's already incentive to hire those people gainfully. So if no one's doing that, then it's probably the case that there's just nothing gainful to do at the moment. Would be the steel man counter, I think.
That's very well done, Jeff. I give you a lot of credit. I knew I could put you on the spot because you do come up with some just being around you when we have conversations and semi arguments and full on arguments with people that don't necessarily agree with us. You always impress me with what you're able to come with up on the spot. So I didn't mind trying to run one over on you. But I came up with, when I was thinking about this in my meditative state that I achieved earlier, when I think about these things, I came up with the free market will achieve the most economic output.
Right.
In contrast to that, so basically just like government versus free market is kind of like almost too broad, but in general, that's like what the difference comes down to. The Austrian will always side with let the free market decide, and Keynesian will always side with taking the ideal central planned solution. Now, the thing that was interesting when I was thinking about this was I kept trying to avoid words like government planned or like centrally planned, because I almost think of it so much as a pejorative, like in my own line of thinking. Like if I accuse someone of like, oh, you just want a government planned solution for this or that, I'm accusing them of being like having a God complex and using that as like a, so when I'm thinking through the Keynesian argument, I'm thinking, can I say this? Would an actual Keynesian say yes? You have to get to the point where you can say the Keynesian argument and have an actual Keynesian be like, yes, that's, maybe they're a little bit of a little stubborn, so they'll say, no, you missed this and that. But yeah, you got to get them to a point where they're generally going to be like, that is what I believe. That you covered one of my more central tenets of what I believe. And what we're going to be talking today, which is the reason that this is important, is to have a logical discourse, right? The first step is you have to not be talking past the person that you're disagreeing with, right? So in order to do that, you have to be able to present their argument that they're trying to present to you in the best way that you can take it. Otherwise, it's just you're just arguing in bad faith. Like you have to be able to listen to them. If it's a person you respect, you have to think that they have a point that they are arguing, at least in their head. Because if you're strawmanning them, then I think it's actually disrespectful, because you're not giving them the dignity to say that they've come up with something that a person would actually think is a good idea, and I'm not even going to spend any time myself trying to convince myself that it's a good idea. So that's like the first step. You got to be able to present their argument.
You should at least try to understand their argument, because if you strawman it, you probably don't even understand their argument. Also, just a side note, if you don't know what Keynesian, and we explained what they are, but for reference, the main school, like mainstream school of thought, is Keynesian economics. That's like what you'll learn in school, versus Austrian. You might learn, actually, my brother's in business school and he's learning like more of the Austrian thought from like a Armenian libertarian, he said, was his professor. So I think that's pretty cool.
What school is it? Because it's not at every school.
I don't know which school he's at.
Oh my God. What the heck?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, it's in Boston. I don't know which one.
Are you sure that's not just a scam? Your brother's getting scammed? I'm up in Boston going to school.
I don't know. I'm a bad listener. But yeah, I just wanted to give that for reference. Right. In case you weren't aware.
Yeah, there's a man named Paul Krugman who is a economist by profession, and he's received a Nobel Prize, and he is the mainstream Keynesian economist in our country. And so that's just, it just goes to show you it's very accepted. So it's not like we're just doing like a little thought experiment to kind of keep ourselves entertained. Like, this is what, if you listen to this podcast and you agree with what we say, we're telling you right now, we are at ends with a person who won a Nobel Prize. So he's like, who are you guys how can you guys argue with someone like he has a Nobel Prize on his side? And it's like, yes, that's why we're here. Like, we wouldn't be making this podcast if it wasn't for the fact that this stuff is important to talk about. We're trying to get people talking about it. And we're trying to win a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
Paul
It's
Krugman,
funny you
give me your
mentioned-
Nobel Prize.
Funny you mentioned that, because there was like a certain point where I was like, am I just like a contrarian? Do I like, because people always like kind of tell me is like, oh, you're always disagreeing with like the conventional wisdom or whatever. And I was like, am I just a contrarian? And then I realized, no, I just don't think it's important to talk about when I agree with mainstream thought. Because if mainstream thought is, in my calculations, correct, there's no need to talk about it really, because, you know, it's already, you know, the right thing is happening most of the time. So it feels like somewhat unproductive to just try and reinforce what's already mainstream thought. And so I realized, no, I think it's important to highlight when, you know, there is disagreement with mainstream thought.
The mainstream thought that he agrees with, by the way, that he's referring to is interventionism in the Middle East. That's what Jeff...
I don't know enough about that. But anyway, so the reason John, I think, was saying we wanted to talk about this is the plan today was to talk about COVID-19. And if you've been a listener to this show, you know we talked about it way back when, in like December, maybe something like that. When it was like still
like a year ago, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I just realized it is December. So not this December, December 2019, almost like a year ago, when it was still in Wuhan and it hadn't really spread yet, except to other Chinese provinces. And I remember we were talking about, you know, is this something government needs to take a more active role in? Because we didn't really know at the time. Like, we were thinking through, and I remember in that podcast we were like, could this be the podcast where we're saying, you know, do more, like the government needs to do more because there's this threat out there that could come here, and like, you know, is there something we need to be doing about this? Something China needs to be doing about this? And it was obviously it was weird for us to be talking, oh, maybe this is something the government needs to be doing more of. And, you know, I have to say, with everything we've seen, you might think, wow, you guys are right. Yeah, the government totally need, and no, that's not the conclusion I'm at right now. I think do less is perfect. It's always correct. Even when we had our doubts, we were still right, because the government screws everything up and they're terrible and they never do anything right. Yeah. And that's the straw man. But we'll get into the steel man. But I think it's a good time to revisit COVID, because the government's giving talks about like lockdowns number 2, stuff like that. And there's a lot of arguments in this space. Is definitely the hot button issue of the day. And so I think it's important to give both arguments their best case and see if we can do it justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was tough because we were saying do more when, like, it was almost like nothing was almost kind of like people were thinking that was the proper approach to it. Mm-hmm. So we're like, actually, we were saying do more, but I think the thesis behind it was like, we got to take this serious. Like, this is like an existential threat that we always have to take serious.
Right.
And when we say do less now, like, I agree, we're saying do less now to specifically our government and governments across the world. It's actually, that thesis hasn't changed. Like, you still have to take viruses very serious. Like, I would actually, like, after seeing what we've seen, it's like, we are so unprepared. Like, we have to really, like the people have to do more. The government always has to do less, which I guess is a more, just to qualify it a little bit. I don't know.
All right. But yeah, so we were talking about steel manning, and so obviously we've just showed our hand to say that we are not in favor of government legislation to handle this problem. But I think we should start by sort of steel manning the argument for lockdowns, mask mandates, social distancing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then sort of get into, I guess, why we disagree with that. I will say, though, as an asterisk up front, I think one thing the government could have done up front that I don't think I would necessarily think is wrong is early on closing the border. Because to me, government is simply the body of force that essentially protects a border and property within that border from essentially other violent threats. Like that is their like sole duty. So things related to a border, I think, is sort of within their jurisdiction. And so perhaps closing a border when we know there's a potential viral threat could mitigate the spread while we prepare, while businesses prepare, while the private sector can get to work on getting samples to research and study and prepare a vaccine, and essentially say, you know, still let the private sector do most of the work, but essentially delaying perhaps the spread within your country just by essentially mostly closing the border. I don't know what your take on that would be.
Yeah, I mean, that's... I agree with that. I almost don't want to get into, because I feel like I'm not as qualified to speak about like what the epidemiological response and the political response should be to the because there's all sorts of things that I've seen and I'm not sure about that I'm still like, but I mean that sounds like it makes sense. A lot of things sound like it makes sense. What I really want to cover in this episode, though, what I really think is important to talk about is like, just because you believe something works doesn't mean that necessitates a policy response. You know what I mean? Like, I just want to really drive home that distinction. I mean, what works exactly? I could probably get into that, but I probably am not prepared to do a comprehensive job, and it kind of takes away from, that point that I'm trying to get at, if that makes sense. But I hear you. I think that makes sense, especially with the role of government that you think is most effective, or the most necessary role of government is like defense from exterior threats. So closing the border, yeah, makes sense. But does that make sense to you? What I'm trying to say, like what I want to get into?
And even that obviously is not cut and dry, because especially with America, you have lots of citizens that are abroad, and what are you going to say? You can't come home. Like it's not as simple as I'm making it out to be. Like closing the border is like almost like a trite thing to say, because it's obviously not that simple. It's not a door. That is like, it's not a switch open close. Like that's, so even that's sort of trite to just reduce it down to that concept. But why don't we get into essentially what is sort of the current mainstream thought on the government's responsibility to handle this virus? What is sort of conventionally thought of as the necessary government action to take? And let's try to steelman that argument as best we can.
Right.
And then we can get into why we disagree.
Right. So the steelman argument for government prescribed pandemic response is the less humans that interact, the less air that they breathe that mixes together, the less the virus spreads, the more time hospitals have to deal with cases of violent cases of the virus, and the more time that individual humans that are infected with the virus can kill the virus and not spread it, right? So just reducing that collision rate of humans mixing breath and getting close to each other will, for a fact, do less harm to people. Will allow the virus to do less harm to people. So therefore,
I would also add
the government should mandate to that effect.
Right. I would also add, like, there are established measures that we can say slow the spread of the virus, and then therefore we should legislate these measures to make sure everyone's taking them, because since you're not only responsible for your health, but you can spread it to other people, it's sort of a systemic risk, and therefore the government can step in to protect other people from you, not just protect you from yourself. And by doing that, by slowing that spread, if we can develop an effective vaccine that can essentially give us immunity, because fewer and fewer people got it in between that time frame, there'll be fewer excess deaths on net by the time we have that vaccine.
Right. Fewer excess deaths from the virus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, okay. So I think that's a good, like, steel man. Because here's the thing about a good steel man. It's like, if you can say it to yourself and you can actually agree with it, you can actually say, like, right. I don't even think that, let me remove myself from my position and say, yeah, that all logically makes sense. Like, yeah, you want to slow the spread. Yeah, you want to give people more time to fight the virus. And yeah, you want to give more time to get the vaccine. So it's like, what can we do to do that? Yeah, this would work to do that, So it's like, okay, that logically makes sense. The only problem is, that argument, and what I would say in response to someone making that argument to me would be, you have to start for accounting the expounding, or the additional, externalities that you haven't stated thus far,
or more simply, the trade-offs.
The trade-offs.
Like what are the trade-offs to doing that?
Yeah, to really any argument that and this is just kind of a logical, like, cognitive dissonance is like the antithesis of logic in a lot of ways. And what I mean by cognitive dissonance is, like, if you are in favor of something, then you tend to align yourself with everything that seems to be in favor with that thing. Like, if you think that something seems to be against something that you're in favor of, then I'm against that thing. So and where I'm trying to go with this is, someone who says masks are good because it slows the rate at which you're like mixing your breath with someone else, right? So therefore there should be a mask mandate, right? People make that logical jump, and I would attribute that more to logical or cognitive dissonance than actual logic, right? Because it's actually not a logical statement. Like, I believe people should wear masks, therefore the government should mandate masks, is not rooted in logic. And some people might be listening and say, yeah, it is. Like, that makes perfect logical sense to me. But I want to offer this counter example. Maybe this will make you think differently. If someone says, I think that kids under the age of 12 should get presents for their birthday, right? Therefore, I think the government should mandate that parents the government makes parents give their kids presents for their birthday. It's like, okay, wait a minute. If that makes you think, if that makes you stop, you kind of understand now that there isn't a logical connection. Just because you believe something is good doesn't mean the government should be the one mandating it.
Right. And this, I think the cognitive dissonance comes from the fact that I think a lot of people view laws as completely identical to what is good and bad. Like, illegal, morality. Bad, good, legal good.
Legal, right.
Right. And that's the problem is laws have their own system of application with its own set of trade-offs. Like, for example, if we're enforcing the birthday present law, that takes resources. And how many more additional resources do we need to do this birthday present law that could be preventing murder, theft, et cetera, et cetera? And to me, the obvious conclusion is any resource you're taking away from murder, theft, whatever, like any horrible crime like that, to make sure every kid's getting a birthday present is a terrible use of resources and should never, ever be done.
Right.
And so to me, there's quite an obvious problem with making the jump from this is good, therefore it should be the law.
Yeah, and I mean, just to even go a little further, like I agree with that 100%. To go a little further, just for the sake of being, like, I really want to show the extent of this, where this argument breaks down. It's like, well, what if, it's going to sound weird, but it's like, what if society, once you instate that, like, every child under 12 years gets should get birthday presents, and you're allocating all these resources. It's like, well, what if in 20 years you have a bunch of kids that they can't handle real life? They're like, oh, well, like, now I'm 18 and I'm used to getting birthday presents all the way until I was 12, and like now I'm 18, I want more birthday presents. And then you just like, you have these kids that are like coddled or whatever. This is just a reason. Like, unless you can, here's the thing: unless you can specifically quantify the amount to which that will or will not happen, you cannot prescribe that as a centrally planned solution. Right? That's my point. Right?
Right. Unless you can calculate all the trade-offs.
Yeah, unless you can tell me right now, and we can go back to masks because that birthday present one is a little bit of a stretch. But unless you can tell me, actually, I would lockdown. I mean, we're talking about masks, but
the mask one.
All right.
Like, yeah. Here's what I would say. I'd say the obvious trade-off with mask mandates is that requires police resources,
right,
to enforce. And it also, if you fine someone for not having their mask, that fine is itself a trade-off. You're taking that person's money, which is a resource for them to do productive activities, to go to the government to then spend, which they may or may not spend productively. And the question is the benefit of incentivizing more people to wear their mask outweighing the cost that you're bearing on society for distributing these fines and spending money on police to monitor this such thing?
Right. Yeah. Further, if you are in favor of a centrally planned mandate, that to me is like, that to me tells me the same, the equivalent of, you have done the cost benefit. You can tell me exactly how many, for masks, for example, you can tell me exactly how many cases you've prevented, right? And you can also tell me exactly how many resources have been siphoned away from citizens through fines. You can also tell me exactly how many resources have been siphoned away through police time and attention. You can also tell me exactly how many resources have been siphoned away through, here's one, like people walking up to other people in grocery stores and getting in fights and altercations, right? That cost to the social fabric, right? Quantify that and then outweigh that with the number of people that got the virus. Like, you have to, like, what we're saying is you have to make this calculation. You can't just say masks are good, right? So therefore they're essentially planning is good, right? You have to make that middle ground steps. Like, those are essential to being able to allocate centrally planned resources to something.
Right. And the reason you cannot just hand wave away, you can't dismiss this is what every entrepreneur does when they do a business. They do these kinds of calculations because at the end of the day, if the benefits outweigh the cost, that's their profit. That's where they make their money.
Right.
And so if they miscalculate, they bear the cost. They bear all the risk. All of it falls on them. But if our government miscalculates, all that risk falls on us equally, even if we're saying this is a bad idea and everyone else is saying this is a good idea. We all share that burden equally. And so it's not necessarily fair to say, the majority, thinks this is a good idea, because it's not just everyone who agrees with it saying, I'll put my ass on the line. If this is a bad law, I'll pay for the additional government spending that this costs. No, that's not how this works. And so because it doesn't work that way, it's completely unfair of someone to say, we don't need to worry about the cost because we all bear the costs together equally. Well, not even equally, some more than others. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why. So this is a very important logical point, and it's going to sound kind of unfair because a lot of the things people say about politicians, let's face it, is unfair, right? Mm-hmm. We try to attack politicians, ad hominem and at, just, there's a lot of things that I like making fun of Trump's hands and stuff like that. It's like, look, it's like being a celebrity, being in the public sphere. It's tough, like just the way people treat you. Okay. I understand that. And I don't like that. I don't think that's a good thing. I think you should, if they're a politician that you don't like, you should only focus on their issues, and be fair at that. So when I bring this up, like, for example, Nancy Pelosi not wearing a mask in an enclosed spa with like other people, right? It's like, oh, you're just being unfair to her. Like, she's just a person just like you and me. It's like, yeah, I know she's a person like you and me. That's not the point. The point is that, yeah, it's hard to wear a mask all the time. It's not really easy. It's not like comfortable. It's not, But if you're going to be a legislator, you're going to be part of the legislative process, and you're going to say the statement, mask mandate is important, like a mask mandate is important, then you are saying that every single, like for example, you're saying every person that breaks this mandate should be fined, right? That's the equivalent statement. So for you to break the mandate, you're saying that you yourself should be fined.
Yeah, and they don't pay fines.
And they don't pay the fine, right?
No.
So it's like, it's not like bringing this stuff up. Gavin Newsom going to like a Thanksgiving with many people or whatever he did, or I guess that was Cuomo.
No, it was Newsom. He did like a dinner at some restaurant, like a restaurant or something.
So this isn't. We're not just being ad hominem. We're not just attacking these people for being people, right? We're saying, no, that's fine. Like, they're people, but they're people that are saying bad arguments. Like, the logic doesn't follow. They've broken that logical, and we can attack them for that. That is a viable mode of attack, to say, look, you've logically said every person should follow this mandate, and you yourself aren't following it. Therefore, you don't even think that every person should follow this mandate.
Right. Because, like, unless you think you're different than everyone else, which I don't see any evidence of. But I think the reason we wanted to bring up the steel manning so much, though, was I see a lot of people who are against sort of these government things taking really bad arguments. And it's really diluting the argument against government intervention by taking on these bad arguments. Because, like we said, the distinction between is this action effective versus is this legislation effective is the key distinction. Mm-hmm. Okay? And a lot of people, because they're against the legislation, the lockdowns, and the lockdown's probably the most important one. We focused on the masks a lot, but really the lockdowns is the most significant one. Closing certain businesses and not others. Those have the biggest trade-offs. And so being against that, a lot of people will take on this argument, oh, well, let's look at the graphs of cases. And they'll say, let's look at Sweden, let's look at Japan, let's look at all these other places, let's look at the graph. Point to me where you took X measure and show me on the graph, where, this measure is being effective. And you can't, because it's hard to tell from the data whether any action was taken at any point. And I don't think these are good faith arguments because
Mm-hmm.
I think there is very logical reason to believe certain policies are effective. Like a lot of people say, oh, well, cloth masks don't do anything because the size of a virus is much smaller than the pore of a mask. Okay, but you also spew water droplets when you talk. And so, like, water droplets will carry large clusters of viral load in the water droplet, and a cloth can block a water droplet. So it is actually probably decently effective at preventing spread. And so just because you can't look at the model of an entire country and say, here's mask mandate went here, so masks don't work. Well, maybe the mask mandate didn't work, but that doesn't necessarily mean masks don't work. And yet, some of them are, in fact, arguing against the legislation, but I do see some people then extending that into, okay, if the legislation isn't working, then therefore that action doesn't work either. And right. This is a very bad argument, bad place to enter, because I think, in fact, a lot of these preventative measures will, in fact, slow the spread, will reduce people's exposure, and can prevent the number of people that get the virus along the way.
Yeah, I mean, just to qualify what Jeff is saying, like the guy that we're both thinking of, Jeff and I, who was making this argument, he has a very famous video right now about it. His name is Tom Woods, and Jeff and I love him. Like, he's awesome. Yeah. He's like a great guy. He has so many good points. He's very well. He's like a really good historian and a really good libertarian, just like a really good thinker and public figure. But he was the one that's making this argument, and we're calling him out because we're just calling it like this is just the logical, So I'm saying this to kind of lend ourselves a little credence that we're not just, we're not just saying that we disagree with these people, so let's attack them. Like, these people, right. we like a lot. We want them to be making the most effective arguments. So we got to call them out when they're not up to par, because like in that same person, Tom Woods had like a Twitter. He had a tweet that like in the comments, like one person was agreeing with him saying my state hasn't had any cases in weeks, therefore like why should we have a mask mandate or lockdowns or whatever? And someone else in the same thread was agreeing with him saying, yeah, the cases are really spiking in my area. These masks and these lockdowns don't work, right? And I'm referring to an episode done by Bob Murphy, who kind of addresses this a little bit further. And I just kind of mentioned this because, like, even the people that you love, even the people that are usually right, it's hard to always have the logically consistent argument. So whenever you hear one, you can say, hey, by the way, that's not actually logically following. Like, you can't make fun of these countries that put in mask mandates and then their numbers went up. Because, for example, the number could have been even higher than it went up to. You don't know.
Right, that's the unseen. Like, maybe it did actually reduce where it otherwise would have been.
Right.
And that's the very same Austrian argument all the time in economics, where it's like,
right, exactly.
It's like, point to me on the CPI chart where the Federal Reserve did their central plan, and you can't. Right. And that's kind of the point, is these systems are complex. And so you can't just do this sort of statistical modeling like this to evaluate these things. But what you can do is say, I'm going to take the null hypothesis, which is I'm not going to divert any resources from people via force, which is how the government works. They take tax money via force, or print money, which is just taking people's wealth without permission, and diverting those to certain activities. And just not doing that is the null hypothesis, right? The government not taking an action doesn't need support because they're not diverting any resources from where they otherwise belong. To then step in and divert resources, you need a compelling argument to do so. Okay? And then our point is, yes, like, masks can slow the spread. Yes, lockdowns can slow the spread. But life isn't all just reducing the number of people that die from COVID. That is not the only relevant variable in the world.
Right.
And we don't exist in a laboratory. So you get a lot of these epidemiologists and scientists, and they think like scientists. They think about this like this is a lab experiment. And you hear them talking about this, and they're like, yeah, like look at all this very compelling evidence that all these various measures, in fact, will reduce transmission rates, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, yes, that's all well and good, but that is not the only relevant variable in society. And so I bet if you were to ask any one of these business owners who's gotten their business shut down, you know, would you rather get COVID or, you know, lose your job? And every single one of them would probably say get COVID.
Right.
And so you cannot make a value judgment, a risk assessment for that individual. Maybe some of them would say, oh, I'd rather lose my business. That's fine. But you have to leave it up to the individual because they hold information that the central planner does not have access to. The central planner doesn't know every individual's risk assessment. The central planner doesn't tell the Red Bull guy not to jump out of space and parachute in whatever because he could die doing that. I get that this is systemic risk, and I don't want to gloss over that point that this is not just each individual's risk. What I'm saying is there is a risk judgment in going outside that every person is taking all the time, every day. I get that this is not the same thing as car accidents or any other type of thing that people like to compare it to. But at the end of the day, there is somewhat of a risk tolerance judgment for each individual that needs to be accounted for that the central planner simply does not have access to.
Yeah. I want to clarify, you said something, you said you can't do statistical analysis. And people, I think some people might hear that and be like, what? You can't, of course you can do, like, that's what,
Right.
That's all you can do. But I do, like, you can't actually, because he's not talking about you can't do statistical analysis in a controlled setting or in a controlled environment, you know, in a lab setting or like, you know, you can do statistical analysis when you have most of the variables controlled for.
Right.
Pretty much all the variables, you know, you have to have all but one control for it, or else statistical analysis is garbage, right? And that's the thing about a economic, that's the thing about legislation. Like, you can't actually do statistical analysis on legislation because what is the control? You have to know what every other scenario would have been in a society, which you can't know. So actually, like, when we say the government should do less, right? We make a podcast about government needs to do less, right? It's not like, let's take a second and say that's not actually ideologically, right? Like, it's not just that some lofty thing that Jeff and I just agreed, like, well, we hate the government, let's make a podcast about why. It's like, okay, let's set up the logical argument, right? You as a government planner, you tell me, when you make a law, tell me exactly what you are impacting, exactly how much, quantify it, exactly the negative impacts, and exactly how much, quantify those. You know, quantify everything, lay it out to me, and explain exactly how you're making it better. There, you can make that law, okay?
And then integrate it for all of the time that law exists. You can't even just do it at steady state at this particular... You got to integrate it over the whole existence of the law.
Right. If you can do that, then feel free to make the law. Until you can do that. Like, that's the logical basis of why there needs to be less government.
The reason you need to reduce it down to logic is because logic produces predictable results. Like, this is just what we learn in science. Like, correlation doesn't mean causation. And why does that matter? Well, because causation is the only way we can actually predict outcomes. And if you can't predict outcomes, then your actions are irrelevant, right? Like, if there's no causal effect between two actions, like, this is why when people used to do rain dances for the rain, that was a waste of their time, because you couldn't actually establish this is why this logical connection is so important, is because that's what lifts us out of poverty, is figuring out actual valuable, productive uses of our time, valuable actions to take. If we're just doing superstition, where we just go, we think this is going to work, but we haven't actually thought it through its logical extent, then it's no better than just like doing a rain dance, hoping it's going to rain.
Yeah. Oh, this was one of the best tweets I ever saw. and it was someone in response to a study where someone was trying to say a takeaway of a study. I have no recollection of what the study was, but the first comment was like, "Oh, this is just you're talking about correlation, and correlation does not imply causation." And the second comment was, and this was what I loved, it was like, of course correlation implies causation. It's just correlation is not causation, right?
Right. Okay.
Once you've found a correlation, you should be, you realize you're almost there. Like you're onto something. A correlation means there's something. It doesn't mean it's exactly the thing you studied. There could be other factors, but now you're on the scent, right? So
it's a clue.
Yeah, it's a clue. Like correlation means there's something there. Like statistically, there's something there, but it doesn't imply that the thing that you set out to study is the variable, because there are confounding variables. That's one of the things that I always see, that people, just because there's a correlation, that's, it's like correlation is not causation. Therefore, if there's a correlation, it's like those things don't cause each other.
It's like, why do we even bother them?
Right. It's like those things very well could cause each other, but the correlation doesn't mean they cause each other. It's just you're one step closer to finding what really does cause each other. And that's
a great point. I really want to reiterate that, because it's like these people who just have this mantra of like, oh, correlation doesn't mean causation. It's like, okay, then why are we even doing correlations? What the heck is the point? It's like, it's because they're clues to what is causally related. And like in statistics class, you always like, they'll give you this silly example. It's like, well, ice cream sales are correlated with murder. And it's like, obviously those aren't but then they'll be like, if you do some deeper analysis, it's like, well, both are correlated with summer. And for whatever reason, murders are up in the summer. But my point is, it leads you to confounding variables. It leads you to causation.
Right.
It's not useless. But to stop the analysis there is problematic. Right. Because if you stop the analysis there, then you might say, okay, well, let's ban ice cream. Then there's no more homicide. Obviously, that's a failure in your analysis. And so, yeah, I think, especially with COVID, we have basically no useful data on legislation versus impact, because there's too many variables and we have absolutely no controls, because we're doing like shotgun policy where it's like all these different policies at the same time across many different countries. There's literally no controls whatsoever. So it becomes impossible to like get at what could be the causal variable, the logical variable here. But that doesn't, just because the statistics aren't necessarily useful, doesn't mean there aren't logical statements you can make about behavior. Like I said, with a cloth mask should logically reduce the probability of you transmitting COVID to someone else, because we know they block droplets and because we know the virus can live in the droplets. So because you can make that very logical step, there's no like confounding variables in between, it then becomes, a fine statement to make that a mask can prevent transmission. But like we said, that does not imply that a mask mandate is a good piece of legislation.
Yeah, so what we're saying, like the appropriate response to someone saying like masks don't work, right? It's like, what they mean by that is like, do they mean mask mandates don't work? Do they mean like you have to, or like someone say masks do work, you say why do they work? Oh, they prevent the spread of droplets and they keep it inside the mask. And then you say, well, what if you touch the mask and then you get on your hands and then you're touching all these surfaces? And it's like, that's actually a logical logical response, right? That's the logical response. So like, oh, masks don't work because now you're touching your face and you're touching. It's like, okay, so now you're having a discourse about a logical progression. You're not just saying, I am among the tribe that believes masks work, and therefore anyone who doesn't want a government mandate that for everyone wearing masks, then I can't even talk to you, right? That's
right. Yeah, and I mean, another thing to say is, it's not as simple as just each of these examples is incredibly simple, right? Like, just because masks work if you're in the same room as someone and they're used effectively, there's no user error where you're touching your mask, you're fixing it or whatever, or it's just going out the side because it's not tight enough or whatever else. That doesn't mean if you're outside walking your dog, you need to be wearing one if there's no one around you. Like, and this is the kind of amount of gray area there is in all real life stuff where they try to simplify it down to wear a mask. Mm-hmm. But it's like, when? Right. There, and this is the sort of individual value judgments people make with localized information. The law is really bad at defining every single edge case, mm-hmm. where it's like, all right, police officers only enforce the law when they're inside, et cetera, this distance. And it becomes impossible to enforce this, adjudicate it, because now, you issue the ticket, now they can contest it in court. Think of all the resources that are going into efficiently applying force to anything you think is worthy of some sort of force. And it's just not feasible.
I kind of want to shift a little bit from there. And I want to bring up the idea that what we hear kind of about this legislation is like, you hear people pontificate, that we just didn't lock down hard enough, or we didn't have enough people wearing masks and stuff, or we're going to try this again, we're going to try this different, okay? Mm-hmm. That key word there is like, we're going to try this. It's like, there are countries that beat this virus, we're mm-hmm. behind. There are countries mm-hmm. ahead of us. There's no more try, right? There's no more, let's figure it out. They've figured out, we need mm-hmm. to understand what they did. It's not more, there's no more trying. Like there was the trials occurred. Now we need to understand, and we need to work off that. There's no more, let's try this, let's try lockdowns again, see if they work, right? That's actually a logical argument. Like, we tried lockdowns, they didn't work, so let's try them again. It's just like, what's different this time? Why are you think that it's going to work this time? Like, you can't just, it can't, this time we'll actually do it. The first time, it's like, well, what's different, this right. time the police are actually going to put people in jail or something. I don't know. Like, even I'm okay, that's actually logical. Like, that will right. be different, but it's like,
yeah,
it's
and
good.
Also, like, I think really the most important thing though is the seen versus the unseen. And it's, even if you say, again, even if you could be like, this worked, mm-hmm. it's like, okay, but what did it cost? And the reality is you can't tell. And this is why central planning just simply does not work, is because you can take the action and it can achieve the desired result, and you can have no idea what it cost you because the thing that it cost you didn't manifest.
Right.
So you have no idea. And so there's calculations that you simply you can't even factor in all of the trade-offs because you don't even know what all of the trade-offs are. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of an impossible task to even attempt to try to essentially plan any sort of policy like this. I think that's all I got.
All right.
For this episode.
That's a wrap. Thank you for listening. We do appreciate all the listens, so keep it up. Keep up the good work.
Keep doing less.